Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Peah, chapter 5, Halacha 5. It's a very short one. Mishnah says, if one sells his field before it is harvested, the seller is permitted to collect for himself the leket, shiurim, and Peah generated by the field if he is poor enough to be eligible, but the buyer is forbidden to do so. Basically what this is that even if all the produce grew while the field was still in the possession of the seller, the obligations and the restrictions of leket, shiurim, and the Peah, they go on the buyer because he's the one who owns the field at the time of the harvesting. So, therefore, the buyer, he's not allowed to take it for himself, can't take gifts for himself because he's too rich because he owns the field. But now that the seller doesn't have the field anymore, if he's already poor and has no property and qualifies for leket, shiurim, and Peah, and the land is out of his possession, he doesn't harvest it, it's harvested by the new buyer, then he's eligible to take it. I don't think it's that common a case, but again, it's an interesting thing about property rights and when a transfer occurs. The next one is a great one. It says, a person may not hire a worker to harvest his field on the condition that the worker's son should glean behind him. So, why would that be? Because the person who's working, he can change the amount that he'll work for because he knows him or his son is getting a benefit from the leket, shiurim, and the Peah. In other words, the only reason that you would have the son follow is to be able to collect it, and it's basically an arrangement where he can get access to it, or the son can get access to it, and in a way you're infringing on the rights of other poor people because what will happen is he's making a deal where he's going to get a lower salary, and the owner in effect is going to be paying a portion of his wages with the property of the poor. In other words, for the poor person to get access to what he's harvesting as he goes with his son collecting behind it, he can undercut proper. And what's the benefit that you're getting? How are you making it up so that in the marketplace you're even with the amount that everyone else would charge? You're basically collecting the poor man's gifts. And the poor man's gifts belongs to everybody. So you can't use their property to offset your business like that. So it's not allowed. Very clever. Mishnah closes that loophole. Next one. The Mishnah reads, one who does not allow the poor to collect the leket, shiurim, Peah from his field, or if he allows one poor person to collect, but does not allow another poor person to collect, or if he assists them, he is thereby robbing the poor. About this it is stated, do not move back the long-standing boundary. That's a quote from the Torah, from the Tanakh. That's going to actually be in Proverbs twice, once in 22:28 and once in 23:10. And the verse is basically requiring that a person may not illegally annex your neighbor's property by moving the marker. So basically, what this is implying is that by helping to assist, and maybe creating a path for them or collecting it and then handing it off to a single one, it's a clear violation of the Torah's command that the gifts are actually to be left by the poor to take on their own. And basically what you're doing is you're depriving the property of the poor, because it should be eligible for any poor person to come. It's not a specific poor person, it's any poor person. And the Mishnah regards this as moving back a boundary, just like if you wanted to take some of your neighbor's land and you move their fence, basically by either helping them collect or preventing any poor people from coming, or giving it to a specific poor person but not allowing another poor person to collect it. You're basically taking property from the class of poor people. In all of these cases, the owner of the field is considered to have robbed the poor, even if he left the leket, shchicha, and the peah in the field for the poor to gather. And there's, the Torah demands that these gifts are made equally accessible to everyone with fair and open competition. So any interference in the process on the owner's part deprives the poor of the legitimate right, which is tantamount to stealing to them. And you can see the Meiri in Baba Metzia 12a, where if you're basically, he's saying over there that if you're depriving the poor people of legitimate rights, it's basically stealing. So the Gemara is going to start and say that, in the first ruling where it was talking about, one who sells his property is permitted to collect its leket, shchicha, and pay it for himself, but the buyer of the field is not allowed to. The Gemara is going to qualify this law and say that the ruling of the Mishnah applies in a case where the seller sold to the buyer both his field and its standing grain. But if he sold to him only the standing grain and left over the field for himself, both the buyer and the seller are forbidden to collect for the poor generated by the field, because with respect to this one, the seller who retained his ownership of the land, I say, I apply the verse, your field. And with respect to this one, the buyer who assumed ownership of the standing grain, I apply the verse, your reaping. So we know that in Leviticus 23:22 it says, and when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not eliminate the corner of your field as you reap, and the leket of your reaping you shall not gather. For the poor person and the convert you shall leave them. So the rabbis are basically saying that the later part of this verse, you shall not gather, for the poor person, is teaching that one is forbidden to take the poor man's gifts generated by his own field, even if he's poor himself. And from the fact that the verse includes references to both your field and your reaping, we can infer that the prohibition applies to both the person who owned the field itself as well as the person who owned the standing grain at the time. Neither can take the leket, shchicha, and the peah that is generated, even if he's poor enough to be eligible. The Gemara is saying, where at the time of the harvest, the seller owned the field and the buyer owned the standing grain, both parties are forbidden to take the gifts for the poor. The Rambam, the Pri Hadash, in his book, the Mayim Chamim, which he cites Tosfot, Rabbi Akiva Eger, and Seif 56 on the commentary of the Rambam, contends that the preceding rule applies only to leket, shchicha, and the peah, whose obligations are a function of the reaping, so that the ownership of either the land or the produce at the time is a crucial factor. And we know that from what we were talking about yesterday, that the Meiser Ani, that's a whole nother case. That's after it's been detached and processed. In the Rambam Hilchos Matanos Aniyim, chapter 6, Halacha 16, it's basically saying that the Meiser Ani shares the same guidelines as the other gifts of the poor, and this would make it forbidden for the seller who retains the ownership of the land to receive the Meiser Ani that is eventually separated from the produce. So in this sort of arrangement, you can't even get the Meiser Ani. the key point here is, and what's different with this distinction is this is the middle thing where one person is buying the standing grain and the other person is holding ownership of the grain. And in that case where they're both poor, let's say they're both poor, neither can take gifts. So in the Mishnah's case where the seller had the land and the attached produce and sold all of it to the buyer, and if and only if the seller is considered halachically poor, can he go and collect the produce. But keep in mind, he's not allowed to make some sort of deal where he holds on to, some portion, economically, where he's saying, "Oh, I'll sell you this field, but I get the rights to the Peah, the leket, the shchicha." You're not allowed to do that because you're basically depriving the other poor people. It has to be free and open competition to collect. Can he go collect it? Yes. Can he go make a deal where he secures an interest in it after he sells it? He may not. And we know that from this Mishnah. So the Mishnah stated, a person may not hire a worker to harvest his field on condition that the worker's son harvests behind him. The Gemara comments, and it says, and if he did so, he is robbing the poor. The Gemara is going to elaborate and say, a field owner who does so, who hires a worker with the condition, is robbing the poor. A worker who does so, in other words, he hires himself out with that condition, is robbing both the owner and the poor. So you could see here that, in the case of the sale where he's making a condition that he's going to get access to it as part of the sale, that is robbing the poor. So in the case where he's harvesting behind, the son is harvesting behind as part of the contract to harvest, he's in effect using the poor people's leket to pay his father's salary, or to offset for the salary. And the Mara Fulda says that when an agreement of this sort is made, where the worker is liable to drop more leket than he ordinarily would because he knows that the fallen produce will be collected by his son, he is stealing from the field owner. In other words, the Tanakama, the Hachamim, the sages are all coming along and saying, you're creating an incentive system with this crooked system. Mr. Field owner, do not take such a deal. And by the way, it's also stealing. You're not allowed to contract that way. And neither the owner nor the worker is allowed to contract that way. But what they're pointing it out is that it's actually really bad for the owner to do it, because now there's an incentive for the worker to drop a little bit more, because now he knows that his son's going to collect it, and he's basically diminishing the amount that the owner would get. So if by the way, says the Vilna Gaon, there's no prior stipulation that was made, it is permissible for a worker's son to follow behind him to collect the leket he drops. In that case, there's no concern that the father might drop extra leket for the son to collect, for he is aware that doing so would constitute outright theft from the owner of the field. We suspect the worker of such action only where the terms of employment include a stipulation regarding his son collecting the leket, inasmuch as the worker presumably consented to receiving a lower wage on account of the agreement, and thus he might feel that he's entitled to give his son extra produce. Okay, that's an interesting thing. And why is it stealing from the poor? The Rosh is pointing out that the worker is stealing from the poor as well, because he is effectively taking their property as payment for his labor. So all sorts of crooked contracting, and you have to be very, very careful in your own life. The Gemara is going to now talk about the final clause, and then we're going to get into something a bit agadic. So the clause in the Mishnah says, And about it is stated, do not move back the long-standing boundary. And the Gemara is going to present two explanations of this Mishnah's intent, both of which understand that the verse being explained, saying, do not move back the boundary of the ascending. So Rabbi Yeremiah and Rabbi Yosef differed regarding the connection of the expression of the ascending in the Mishnah's exposition. One said, these are the ones who ascended from Egypt with Moses. We know that, in other words, the verse ascending, one does not veer from the regulations and the boundaries that were set forth in the Torah given to the Jews who ascended from Egypt to Moses. So the Rambam in his commentary on the Mishnah points out among these regulations are leket, shchicha, and the Peah requirements, and invoking the memory of the redemption from the bondage of Egypt is a particularly apt way to admonish those who would cheat the poor. And as mentioned before, that this appears twice in the Proverbs, and according to the opinion of that, the ascending in this verse, are those who ascended from Egypt, the Mishnah is referring specifically to the Proverbs where it says that your forefathers made. So basically, what it's saying is it's saying that do not encroach on the rights of the poor, and this ascending is going to allude to poor people who are leaving Egypt with Moses, and it's basically saying moving this boundary line is basically moving what Moshe Rabbeinu said. That's one way to interpret it. And the other one said, these are the poor who have descended from their possessions. They are euphemistically referred to as the ascending, inasmuch as the same manner as we exclaim about a blind person, he is full of light. So, according to this view, ascending is going to allude to the poor people, and not just that they're leaving, that they're poor people leaving Egypt, but that it's a euphemism that instead of saying they descended from their possessions, they're saying that they ascended. And it's a nice way to do it. It's like for a blind person, they're saying, instead of saying, he only sees darkness or whatever, they're saying, no, he's full of light. So the Gemara now is going to present a third opinion, which interprets the ascending as referring to the poor, but with a totally different reason. Rabbi Yitzchak says, the verse refers to poor people and the ascending because of their migrant activities. And as the scripture states elsewhere, in Isaiah 58:7, it says, and the itinerant poor bring into your home. So it says, Rabbi Avin said, it is if God were saying, if you did so and you brought the poor into your home, I consider it as though you had brought bikurim, the first fruits, to the holy temple. For it is stated here, and the itinerant poor bring into your home, and it is stated there. Over there being in Exodus 23:19. So you have a Gezerah Shava where it says, basically it's pointing out that from over there it's saying, the choicest first fruit of your land shall you bring to the house of Hashem, your God. And by employing this common terminology in these two phrases, the scripture is indicating that they are of a similar significance. So basically, what this is, this third thing is saying. This third thing is saying that the verse is referring to the poor as itinerants because they get up, they go begging from house to house, and basically what it's saying is saying that it suggests that the Gemara is citing this other opinion to provide an example of what the scripture is gonna be saying, with regard to the poor, and that you can actually be using it as an opportunity to be giving bikurim in this time. We're going to move on to Halacha 6.